Hey, what's up, class? Welcome to our online lecture of the week. My sincere apologies for this one being late. I had a few um, unexpected things happen this week, which I'll share on Tuesday. But I'm trying to get back on track with things and with our class. So I didn't want to just submit a haphazard. Um, Mediocre lecture. So this is a finely crafted lecture, which I hope you enjoy and hope you make all the way through. All right, let's get started. So we're transitioning into chapter 4 and 5. This will be a short unit, just 2 chapters. We're going to have a test after fall break, I think the week after fall break. But really, chapters 4 and 5 are about energy and how cells use energy. So let's look at a little overview of chapter 4. So chapter 4 is about enzymes, metabolism, and cellular respiration. Section 4.1 are about enzymes and metabolism, which we will cover in this online lecture. We'll look at enzymes, the workers of the cell, and metabolism, which is how your cells acquire energy and use it for work, for cellular work. And then the second section, only 2 sections in this chapter, cellular respiration. We're going to be learning about ATP, and we're actually going to cover that on this lecture as well, the energy currency of the cell. And then on Tuesday, we will cover cellular respiration, which is how the cell makes ATP, how it uses food, energy from food to make ATP, how other nutrients other than glucose, which is what cellular respiration uses, are metabolized, and also how metabolism happens without oxygen. All right, so for this lecture, we'll end on ATP. So let's look at enzymes. So as we've learned in chapter 2, all of life can be boiled down to chemistry. So cells, which are the smallest unit of life, can be boiled down to 4 organic macromolecules that have unique properties because of the atoms and the electron configurations of those atoms. So depending on that, the molecules will be either polar or nonpolar. They'll be hydrophilic or hydrophobic. They'll interact with hydrogen bonds with other substances or form other kinds of bonds. And so all of life can be boiled down to chemistry, which is really important. And in the cell, at any given time, you have thousands of chemical reactions that are happening. So your cell is like a bag of chemical reactions, which is the chemical reactions are what, whenever the cell is doing something, that's a chemical reaction being done by a protein. And whenever you hear the word metabolism, really what metabolism means is just all of the chemical reactions that take place in your body. So if you have high metabolism, it just means it's a very general term to say that you have a lot of chemical reactions happening in your body, which explains why people that have high metabolism are normally thin, because there are more chemical reactions happening which require energy, and so you're burning energy more often, right? And then enzymes are the workers of the cell that are performing most of the chemical reactions. So whenever you hear me speaking about a chemical reaction in the cell, there is a protein or an enzyme that is behind that. So what are enzymes? Enzymes are usually proteins that speed up the rate of chemical reactions in the cell. So enzymes can also be RNA. I would say 90% of enzymes are proteins, but they can also be RNA. And so these enzymes, these organic macromolecules, are going to speed up the rate of chemical reactions that are happening in the cell. And so catalyze, bolded here, is the scientific biological term for speeding up. But that's all it means. And each enzyme is named for the reaction, the chemical reaction that's being catalyzed. And they end in the suffix ase, ace. So for example, sucrase catalyzes the breakdown of sucrose, and that's the example that we have here on the slide. In green is the enzyme sucrase, and it's breaking down sucrose into its monosaccharides, glucose and fructose. Lactase might be another enzyme that you've heard of, but it's what catalyzes the breakdown of lactose. So people that are lactose intolerant have a mutation in the gene, the blueprints, the DNA blueprints to make this protein. And so this protein is non-functional and can't break down lactose. So people that are lactose intolerant are simply missing the worker, the enzyme that breaks down the lactose found in dairy products. And then we'll talk about DNA polymerase in the next unit, but this is an enzyme that synthesizes DNA. It polymerizes, hence polymerase, polymerizes DNA. It brings many nucleotides of DNA together as polymers. All right, so how do enzymes work? How do they speed up chemical reactions? Every chemical reaction requires an initial input of energy in order to get started. So think of a Jenga tower. I'm going to try my best to bring a Jenga tower to class next week because it'll help illustrate this concept beautifully. But a Jenga tower, you need to put a little bit of energy to knock that thing over, right? But no, it doesn't require a lot of energy to knock it over, which is what makes the game so fun, right? It's hard. It's very easy to topple it. So you have to be very careful. But that energy that you have to give it at the beginning in order to topple it over is the activation energy. And you can think of activation energy like a hill that has to be overcome in order for the chemical reaction to proceed, right? So imagine, this is a diagram from your textbook. Imagine that the bikers getting from one side of the hill to the other is a chemical reaction. So on the left would be sucrose, and on the right would be sucrose broken down into glucose and fructose. That same chemical reaction we saw on the last slide. So in order for that to happen, that chemical reaction to happen, you have to give it energy, right? You have to actually, it's like breaking those two things apart with your hands almost. You have to give it that energy. And that's that hill that those molecules, bikers here, have to overcome in order to proceed with a chemical reaction. So what an enzyme does, the way it speeds up a chemical reaction is by lowering the activation energy of those reactions. So it basically makes it to where now you don't need to, it makes it easy, makes the sucrose easier to break, for example. It makes it to where you have to give it less energy in order to proceed with the chemical reaction. And so now basically it lowers that energy barrier, that hill, so that most of the reactions, so that the chemical reaction can happen quickly. So this makes it easier for the reaction to occur, right, if the hill is lower, and thus the reaction will occur faster. The reaction is catalyzed. So let's look at the example of sucrose. So imagine there's no enzyme present. Sucrose will actually break down spontaneously, but it might take hours or days for that to happen. But with an enzyme, with sucrase, that reaction is going to happen in a split second. So the enzyme actually speeds up the chemical reaction. And this is important because in order for me to be doing what I'm doing right now, to have a thought and then speak it, move my lips and my lungs so that they can expel air and form these words so that you can hear them or my computer can record them, that requires a lot of quick chemical reactions. And if there were no enzymes, those reactions would be too slow to sustain life. So enzymes are necessary for life because they speed up the chemical reactions that need to happen in order for life to occur, in order for us to be able to communicate even. So let's look a little more at how these enzymes speed up chemical reactions. So enzymes, let's look at the structure of an enzyme. Enzymes have an active site, which is labeled on the diagram here, which binds the specific substrate or molecule that that enzyme works on. So each enzyme has like a little pocket, which is the active site. and that's going to match the substrate. In this case, we're still looking at sucrase, so the substrate is sucrose. And what happens is when that molecule, when that substrate binds to is bound by the enzyme, it's going to alter the shape of the enzyme. So as soon as it fits into that pocket, the enzyme itself is going to change shape. And that changing of shape is going to help speed up the breakdown of the substrate or the synthesis of the product. So an enzyme can break stuff down or it can put stuff together. So what's happening here is that the sucrose binds the pocket of the enzyme changes shape, and that stresses the bond that's binding the two monosaccharides together. And then it makes it easier, it lowers that activation energy, so it makes it easier and faster for sucrose to break into its two monosaccharides, right? And so then after the sucrose is broken, those products are released. So glucose and fructose would be the products. And the enzyme now goes back to its normal shape and it's ready to do another reaction. So what's happening is that the change in shape of the enzyme is what's lowering the activation energy. And it's important to realize that each enzyme, it's not consumed in the chemical reaction. It can be reused time and time and time again. Something that's important to understand about enzymes is that enzymes are very specific. So like I told you guys, each enzyme has an active site, has that little pocket that is specifically shaped to only fit the molecule it works on. So that makes it very specific. So there is no other enzyme that can break down sucrose. Only sucrase can. And like we've learned in chapter 2, the shape of a protein, in this case of the enzyme, is determined by the sequence of amino acids. So if you were to change one amino acid, it would change the shape of the enzyme to where it might not be able to bind to its substrate, which is what happens with lactose, right? Like we mentioned earlier. So lactose intolerant people have an amino acid substitution in the protein in that enzyme, and it makes it unable to bind to lactose to break it down. So people with that mutation get really bloated when they eat dairy. And remember, another thing that's interesting is that there's thousands of chemical reactions happening at any given time. So cells have to control the activity of these enzymes by using cofactors or inhibitors. And we're not going to go into that deep in depth, but just realize that, you know, it's not that you literally have thousands of enzymes, right? It's not that they're all working just willy-nilly and doing a billion chemical reactions. They are specifically turned on and off when they're needed. Your cell is like a information processing machine. It is a very complex machine that performs chemical reactions in a very specific order. So it needs to be able to turn the enzymes on and off as they're needed. So they do this by using cofactors and inhibitors. All right, so a little bit on metabolism. The metabolic rate is the measure of your energy use. So again, if you have a high metabolism, you have a high metabolic rate, which means you're doing a lot of your body, the cells in your body are performing a lot of chemical reactions, maybe more than an average person, and so you're using up more energy than the average person. And this depends on the speed and the efficiency of different enzymes. It'll change according to activity levels. So if you're more active, your cells have to use more energy, that your metabolism will be higher. So when you exercise, the reason exercise is good is because you're increasing your metabolic rate. You're increasing the amount of energy that's being used by your cells in order to perform, in order to move your body, right? Your basal metabolic rate is the energy use it's the energy your body uses when you're resting, and that's typically 70 calories an hour or 1,600 calories per day, which is why the typical recommended calorie intake is around 2,000 for men, and I guess 1,600 or 1,500 for women, something like that. But it has to do with, because of this, your basal metabolic rate. So obviously, if you're doing more exercise, you're going to need to eat more calories in order to make up the calories that you've burnt. Which means the secret to losing weight, it's not any magic diet, it's not any magic fad, it's not super foods or nutrients. I mean, really, you can just boil it down to burn more calories than you consume. If you're exercising and burning more calories than you're eating, you're going to lose weight because your body's going to have to, it can't get all the energy it needs from the food. It's going to have to get some of that energy from your body fat and from other parts of your body. And the metabolic rate is influenced by many factors. Exercise, we just mentioned, but the amount of exercise you do, the length of the exercise, the intensity of the exercise. It's also influenced by gender. So males require more calories and energy, typically because males have more muscle mass, which means if you have more muscle, you burn more calories because muscle cells require more energy. And it's also influenced by your genetics. So there is a genetic component to obesity, right? Your book touches on this a little bit. Obesity can be inherited. You can inherit genetics that make you have a lower metabolic rate, which means you'll burn less, you'll use less energy, which means you'll be accumulating extra calories and storing them as fat, right? And then it also, your genetics plays a role in how your body uses the fat. Some people burn more fat or tap into that fat quicker than others. And so there is a genetic component, but even what we'll learn later is that the genetics sets the ceiling and the floor. So basically, your genetics determines how skinny and how fat you can possibly be, but there's a pretty big window there. So depending on your lifestyle, exercise, and diet, you can either be near the floor and be pretty decently, and when I say skinny, that's the wrong word to use. I mean healthy weight, right? Being too skinny, as you'll read in your textbook, isn't good either. If you're too skinny, you run into health problems as well. So I'm talking about being a good healthy weight. That would be, everyone can be a good healthy weight, depending on your lifestyle. But sometimes your genetics makes it a little tougher to get there. All right, so let's talk a little bit about energy and about ATP. So what is energy? Energy can simply be defined as the capacity to do work, the ability to do work. And cells do work, so they require energy, right? When your muscles move, that's cells doing work, muscle cells doing work. And they require energy for that, which is why you need to, if you're going to do a marathon, you need to eat carbs because you need to supply energy for those muscles. And it's also why if you exercise consistently, you're going to end up burning more calories than you eat and you will lose fat. So what cells do is they convert energy stored in the chemical bonds of food molecules into cellular work. So food molecules have energy stored in chemical bonds, and what cells do is they convert that energy into useful energy that can be used for cellular work. And the stored energy is called potential energy. So you'll find this in chemical energy, which is the energy in food molecules and in other molecules. You'll also find this in gravitational energy. So when you lift an object above your head, it'll drop with more energy. It'll exert more energy than an object you drop lower, right? I'm not talking about the speed it falls. I'm talking about the energy. So the higher an object is, the more potential energy it has because of gravity. And then also concentration gradients. And I'll come back to that once we learn about cellular respiration. So where does energy come from? Can cells create energy? Well, for that we need to understand the first law of thermodynamics. And so scientific laws are just descriptions of how we see the world work. And what this law describes is that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only be transferred or converted. All right, Genesis 1, anybody? So God created energy and boom, that was it. That is all the energy that we have to work with. No more can be created or destroyed. And so anytime you see, anytime your body needs energy, it can't create it. You need to convert it from food into useful energy for your muscles. So in ecosystems, energy is converted. All energy in an ecosystem ultimately comes from the sun, and then plants harness that sun energy, turn it into sugar via photosynthesis, and other animals then, all the other animals that can't make their own foods, eat plants, and ultimately that's how we survive as well, is we have to eat other animals or plants in order to get our food. Plants are the animal, or I guess I should say organisms that can do photosynthesis are the only organisms that can make their own food. All other organisms need to eat other organisms to get food for energy. So where do our body cells as humans get energy, and how do they use it for cellular work? Again, our cells, back to the first law of thermodynamics, our cells cannot create energy. They have to convert it. So we have to eat food. So the first step of how our cells get energy and how they use it is we ingest food into the digestive system. Our digestive system breaks it down into nutrients. Those nutrients, like monosaccharides and protein, amino acids and lipids, are absorbed into the bloodstream and then transported to every single cell in your body through your circulatory system, right? And then in the cell, the nutrients are broken down further and used by the mitochondria to make ATP. So remember, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It's the energy generator of the cell. And so the mitochondria uses the nutrients from food to make ATP. And then ATP is this molecule that is used by the cell to do cellular work. All right, and so what is ATP? Well, before we get to that, let me just summarize then. So food, the reason we eat food is to make ATP, and then ATP can be used to do cellular work. So what is ATP? It's the energy currency of the cell. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and the name is kind of self-descriptive. Adenosine is an adenine and a ribose and 3 phosphate groups. Sound familiar? So you can probably recognize this structure from nucleotides, right? Nucleotides are the monomers for DNA and RNA, and they also have a nitrogenous base. In nucleotides, it can be A, C, T, G, or U. They have a sugar, a ribose, and they have a phosphate group. Now, nucleotides in DNA and RNA only have 1 phosphate. ATP has 3 phosphates, which is why it's adenosine triphosphate. Anyway, ATP is the dollar of the cell when it comes to cellular work. So it's the energy currency of the cell. So to explain this, imagine you're going to your favorite grocery store, say Kroger, and you want to pay for your groceries with Indian rupees, which is a currency in India, or Chinese, whatever the currency is in China, I don't even know. But you give the grocery clerk this foreign currency, they're going to be like, get out of here. We don't accept foreign currency. We only accept dollars. Well, it's the same way in your cell. When a cell needs energy to perform a chemical reaction, to get over that hill, over the activation energy, It can't use a carbohydrate, it can't use a protein. It's like trying to pay with Indian rupees. It has to use ATP. That's the dollar of the cell. So ATP provides the energy required for most proteins to function. So what ATP does is it activates or energizes proteins so that they can perform their work in the cell. And it does this by phosphorylation, which is simply transferring one of the phosphate groups, one of those purple P's there at the end of ATP, to another molecule. So here in this figure from your textbook, you see that the ATP molecule donates one phosphate to the enzyme, and that changes the shape of the enzyme. And in this case, it changes the shape so that it can bind to its substrate and perform whatever chemical reaction it needs to perform. So this is a very common way of how ATP energizes proteins, how it is used as a source of energy in order to perform chemical reactions. So let me just explain this a different way. That if you go back to the figure, that one phosphate it's donating to the enzyme, you'll notice that the phosphate is negatively charged. And you know that when you change a functional group in a molecule, so when you add a negatively charged atom or functional group like this phosphate, which is a phosphorus atom bound to 4 oxygens, that changes the chemical properties of that molecule. So when this phosphate is added to this enzyme, it's going to change the chemical properties of the enzyme, specifically its shape. And now that it's changed shape, it can do its whatever function it needs to do. And you'll notice too that along with the enzyme changing its shape, you're left with ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, because you've lost one of the phosphates at the end there. And so ATP energizes proteins so they can do cellular work such as mechanical work. So whenever you move your muscle cells, your immune system cells, which are hunting viruses and bacteria that infiltrate your body, tumor cells that migrate, that spread. Whenever a tumor spreads, it's actually using ATP to move. And the flagella of bacteria and other single-celled organisms, like in this figure here, Chlamydomonas, those flagella are like little propellers and they require ATP. ATP also energizes proteins for transport, for membrane transport. We touched on this at the end of chapter 3. So there are, whenever you want to transport a substance against its concentration gradient, so from an area of low concentration to high concentration, you're going against the flow, and that requires energy, just like it would require energy to move to go upstream a river on a canoe. So you need energy to transport that substance, and that's where ATP comes in. ATP energizes that protein channel so it can move that substance against its concentration gradient. And it also energizes proteins to do chemical work, so activation of enzymes that catalyze chemical reactions, like sucrase, which we just saw. And sucrase isn't the only one, right? There's literally thousands of enzymes that do similar things, either break proteins apart, or in this case, you can see in this example, this enzyme is bringing 2 monosaccharides together to form a disaccharide, and it uses ATP to provide the activation energy. So after you use ATP, it loses a phosphate group, right? Because it donates that group to an enzyme or another protein, and it becomes adenosine diphosphate. So to replenish ATP levels, your cell does this really awesome metabolic reaction called cellular respiration. It replenishes the ATP levels by adding a phosphate back to adenosine diphosphate, to ADP. So here you have ADP plus an extra phosphate, and cellular respiration adds that phosphate back to ADP in order to make ATP, right? And it uses energy from your food to do this. So this is why you eat. This is why you're consuming food, is so your cells can take that energy in the food to make ATP, to replenish ATP levels, so your cells can continue to do cellular work. Because remember, your cells only accept one form of currency, and that's ATP. It won't accept foreign currency. It has to use ATP. And in order to make more dollars, you need energy from food. In order to make more ATP, you need that energy from food. And so really, ATP and ADP cycle continuously in the cell. ATP will provide energy for cellular work, like we've seen. And then ADP is reformed into ATP by cellular respiration. All right, and here in the bottom there, you see the diagram of cellular respiration, which occurs in the mitochondria. So the mitochondria is the ATP making machine. It is a money making machine, the energy house, powerhouse of the cell. So in our next lecture on Tuesday, we're going to answer this question: how does cellular respiration use energy from food to make ATP? So I'll leave you on that cliffhanger, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Rewatch it as many times as you like, and have an awesome weekend. See you guys.